Welcome back to the PFC podcast. The views and opinions you are about to hear are the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of anyone else. Now on to the podcast.
Welcome back to the PFC podcast. This is Dennis, and today I'm with Sean. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. As previously mentioned, I'm just over 48 hours without sleep, which is good for me. It's hit my prime. So excuse the immense coffee drinking and dipping I'll be doing.
Awesome. Well,
which is kind of, even if I got good sleep, it's probably the same. So,
yeah. But it's been a hot minute since you've been on the podcast. So would you mind just doing a real quick introduction of yourself?
You bet. Sean McKay, specialize in dynamic, high threat rescue, really casualty management. So kind of where you combine casualty care with access, extraction, evacuation. That's kind of a whole, kind of see it as a big picture instead of two segmented things of rescue being separate than that. And so I've been really fortunate through the years of working with some phenomenal groups that rely on rapid iterations of innovative TTP development and things like that, and solving problems I could have never imagined unless I was working with them. That's been good. So specialize in nonlinear physics, which is pretty much what real world application is. It kind of helps guide you a little bit from going down rabbit holes that don't template operational success. But so that's kind of what I've done for the last 20 something years or so.
Yeah, and definitely when it comes to that type of environment, definitely the people that do this for a living rely on him. So I'm going to rely on you for this question because Subterranean, the only time I go subterranean is when it's in a mall or a subway. It's a great big problem. It's been a great big problem for a really long freaking time, and it always seems to be the area that we run to when we don't have a better answer when it comes to bad things happening on the surface. It's like, well, we'll just go underground. I see it a lot when it comes to especially like Ukraine, and definitely it's happening more when they're talking about Iran and Gaza and all these other things. We have to go into a subterranean environment that's probably already been damaged from artillery or rockets or what have you, and we're going to need to set up shop. So if you wouldn't mind just telling me, other than now the rocks on top are broken, what other horrible things can be waiting for me when I first go in?
I think subterranean, a lot of things, as you and I discussed before, a lot of things just get put over this subterranean title page. But in reality, a lot of people, a lot of thought processes from command and things like this in the past have been trying to linearize a nonlinear problem. And there's always problems with that. I think from a medical standpoint, it's the, pediatrics, they're just small adults, and you know how thick up that is. And so the same thing when you take the context out of specific environments. So every environment you have has pathology, right? You have an environmental pathology that's in there. And I'll be honest, the subterranean is rich with pathology, and a lot of it is unpredictable, right? So when we get into that like VUCA T-squared type of thing, it's volatile, it's ambiguous, complex. It's you're having to make decisions under threats, emerging threats that are both biological, people, and environmental, which becomes exponential, and trying to manage that, because it's usually you just get kind of that operational sucker punch. And so when you look at it, the examples you gave up with subterranean in a mall, or parking and subways are very problematic, right? When you get into some of the things, I mean, if you look, in Afghanistan with Karez, those things were used already built and ready to go by the time we went in there, from when the Russians were. That was a safe haven. That's where they stored weapons, and that's where they hung out. And Karezes go down to that waterway, so that's good for them. But they're very elaborate and easy to ambush in, and then they started building homes over them. So we had guys falling into Karezes and things when U.S. was there. It's insanely problematic. So you have your man-made, you have your natural subterranean environments, but within the last 20 years, it's been exponential, with Army intelligence coming back with the amount of sites that both state players and non-state have been using that as their hubs of where they're going to be from, whether it's to try and avoid kind of WMD type of missile attacks and things like this, to just the security of it and being able to secure that and fortify it is pretty advantageous. So us going into something like that is very problematic. Us just going through and clearing an area that in there is insane. When you look over a lot of those AARs, very common to be in oxygen depleted areas, higher carbon dioxide, things like this. And unless you're, kind of a specialized team or a chem bio type team, no one's really rolling around with a bunch of air monitoring systems, be able to pick up on this. And so between just the atmospheric problems that can go in there to logistical problems as far as sustainment from just water, food, communications usually falls to crap very, very quickly. And those, especially if you have something built up under there with any kind of, and when I say built up, I mean, it can just be shoring, and you could be something that's going in between our southern states and Mexico, with collapses that have occurred when we've done some trainings there that are very problematic. But so the environmental outside of the other pathologies of booby-traps and things like this, you're just kind of a sucker for something as nonchalant as a fire when you're subterranean is pretty much a ticket now out. Very difficult to try and escape that. You don't have a lot of egresses. Typically, you'll have some ports, and some naturally have light, and that's kind of their formal light across here. But there's so many considerations, so many variables that exist in that subterranean, from the atmospheric issues to the comms and communications, to the regular threat that you're going after anyways in SOCOM unit, to things that just happen that they are just very unpredictable. And no matter what training we've ever been on, whether we've done full mission profiles and things like this, we've always got pages of notes afterwards doing AARs where, okay, we never saw that before, didn't think of that. And if it happened once, it'll happen again. It's the attitude to have, not that it probably will never happen again. You just, if it happened once, then now you've got to develop all new TTPs and capabilities to mitigate those problems. But you and I could literally talk about, how many different, from caves to specified, mountain caves, from Afghanistan to what was it, Syria to across that whole Middle East. And now they're choosing to put their command and control areas and stuff like that into those regions too, almost daring us to go into it. But collapse is a crazy one, because you're not, we think of collapse if it's underground going into the trade centers or anything like that. First responders, it's a slow process typically, which is not necessarily but that fast and light soft attack assault into a place could be. It's very deliberate because of monitoring the conditions and collapse potential shoring inside there. You're not going to have a lot of groups in soft that are just rolling in with a bunch of Paratech gold struts and doing that. So a lot of your mitigation factors when you do this. Once you're in there and you're committed, you've got to really keep a very open mind and be able to utilize your organic assets or the organic assets that exist in underground in that facility to be able to solve a lot of those problems. As an example, when we teach collapse structure, you are, if you're possibly going to do a rescue on somebody, although there's so many aspects to it as far as lifting and this and that, but those foundational principles of lift an inch, crib an inch, and things like this. But what are you cribbing with, right? We don't have fire trucks full of cribbing that we can roll in and do it. But if a blast happened, and this is not subterranean, but if a blast happened and you're responding to that building that has collapsed, being able to identify what kind of collapse it is, where load-bearing walls are, be able to have your highest percentage of being able to do rapid searches in there for anybody that's alive, but being able to use parts of that building that blew up and collapsed. There's building material everywhere, from concrete blocks to wood to 2x4s and 6x6, all these things that you can very effectively do the same thing with what's around you. And that's really what we run a lot of the FMPs for, and it's amazing how effective it is, because we are actually lifting extremely heavy, lots and tons of rubble to get into areas using just pieces of the building that have blown up. And so you got to become very innovative and very comfortable with innovating solutions quickly when you know you will never have what you wish you had.
Maybe I'll be more specific for the subterranean. Let's say I want to occupy we have a multi-story building, let's say 10 stories. It used to be 10 stories. Now it's less than 10 stories. It's been hit by some high explosive, like a HIMARS or ballistic, maybe not ballistic missile, but a large explosive made it much shorter than it was before. And I have the idea, I want to go into the basement of that and be able to set up shop for an extended period of time. That deliberate process. So you're sending your first dude in there to at least look and see how bad is it, and can we occupy this? Is it even possible? What things are you going to assess for? What things are you going to look at? You're probably, I would imagine, start taking pictures of stuff, and then just like any kind of reconnaissance, then you're going to come back and start making your plan, get supplies, etc., to start this process. Because like you mentioned, it's very slow and deliberate, and if you want to keep everyone around on this earth longer, you'll take the time to plan for this.
Yeah. So one, being on your podcast a few times before, since this various rescues, it's probably no shocker that fortunately my Adderall's kicking in, but I'm ADHD. So anytime that you're talking about doing that, and you said it, I think twice so far, as far as open up shop, I can't get DMX out of my mind. So I think that'll be our subterranean song. Now it'll be stop, drop, shut them down, open up shop. Until Rough Riders roll, apparently. So with that, with your audience, because I take this to non-medical people training too, and I always give the example from medics, is when you think about the backbone of a medic, a soft medic and assault medic, is being able to very effectively, very rapidly assess that patient. I would take the same foundation that you know by heart on how you assess that patient, whether it's somebody that's been involved in an explosive, or it's a shoot, penetrating trauma from IED or gunshot wounds, or whatever that is, the helicopter crash, and come up with a way that you're able to template success using the same technique that you assess patients when you're starting to assess that. Except you're going to be doing, just like a patient, ongoing assessments as you go, making sure, things that you're looking out for, because you saw this, you're going to be thinking this. And I would say utilize that as your template. So we always kind of say right person, right job. If you are having to mitigate and get through kind of the collapsed area. I definitely don't want the corn-fed, barrel-chested freedom fighter rolling in first on there, because all those enlarging areas to get into those spots and things like this, especially with anything that has a potential of a collapse before, even if it had dedicated building subterranean areas, you're going to have tight areas to get through. And so a lot of times we pick that, that small little
the tunnel rat.
Just roll exactly, and let him start making stay in comms for, in that kind of voice type of thing, if applicable. And everyone kind of behind is who starts making and enlarging those larger as he's trying to mill through, because speed becomes your security and a lot of things like that. So, if you're trying to mitigate that, you have so many different threats, as we discussed before. I would be very concerned as I'm moving through with oxygen content. So, what is something that we could do? It goes into your PFC, right, where you have that, it's good, better, best type of, it's that stagger type of hierarchical thing. But, even grabbing, we've done this before, just even a pulse ox roll, any kind of entitled, anything that you can have that can monitor and be like, whoa, this isn't just from me breathing heavy or whatever. You can see that marked type of thing, being able to mark your locations as you're moving through there. Because a lot of times once we get into there, you may have, especially in something that had something subterranean basement going down pretty far, things like this, you have different options on which way you can go, but being able to mark that, so if comms does get lost or you do go down, being able to have basically kind of a CCIR or some sort of contingency type of in place to be able to get that person out, but active monitoring and being able to, over radio or verbally, force them to remember to check, where they're at, take a break, stop, hit it on, what you're reading, where you at, blah, 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 going in. But you basically, it's almost like a PFC, you kind of got to keep your head on a swivel as you move down there. You're looking for any kind of seepage, leakage, fluid, water, anything that's coming through there, debris dropping down as you're going through. When you're doing this, it's not fast, so you're going to have some sort of logistical support. It may take hours and hours to start moving through there. And you hear people that have had to do that somewhat spontaneously sometimes are running out of water, any kind of sustainment. Just being in the dark, moving through there, there's a whole mental thing that goes on that's hard to tune out sometimes, where your vision is getting crappy, and you're having to go by feel, and you're running into dead ends. It becomes mentally exhaustive, besides the physical aspects of that. But as you're going down there, there's a lot of different papers that have been written for quite a long time. I mean, there's some really solid ones out there that even talk about Karez's, but more recently, from 2018 on, there's quite a bit of literature out there. And if you kind of just Google atmospheric environmental pathology, environmental hazards, a lot of things are called like IDLHs, immediate danger to life and health. And in that, obviously, somebody, the bad guy down there, is obviously immediate. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about the certain gases that are released, certain oxygen depleted areas, so things that displace oxygen, different minerals, fuels, things like this that can be down there. The potential for any kind of fires, things that can get sparked off by nothing more than radio clicking and things like this that become problematic. And so with it, I think every geographic area has some very unique pathology that you have to be. So researching that and just trying to come up with some sort of mitigation strategy where it's not a one-for-one type of thing, but What are those things that you can bring into that game, into that fight, that serve multiple purposes on there, but just simple sustainment, because it's going to take a long time. It's going to be uncomfortable, and your body is just going to be eating up everything. You're going to get drained very, very fast. You're going to feel like you've been in there for 8 hours and it's been 45 minutes. So with that, I think brainstorming and going to worst case scenario, and then backing out of that is where you need to go. People usually don't go far enough onto what they could potentially encounter. How can you perceive it, and when can you catch that small fire when it's still small, right? It's HRO type of high reliability, or I want to, where I can still mitigate it, versus, keeping a blind eye, not seeing it, not keeping your head on a swivel, not understanding what's going on contextually. And then before you know it, it's catastrophic, not for the whole team. And so with it, I'm hoping I touched on your question. The problem is, when you get into that specifics, I can't really relay enough that there's so much to it, and it's one of those things where it may seem overwhelming and impossible, but it's not. It's picking out those things that are kind of worst case scenario. And in it, you hear a lot of things typically with heuristics in a negative standpoint, where it kind of has heuristics. You got to be careful because it causes you to have unconscious bias and sorts of things. There's deliberate heuristics, and I would invite people to read up. There's I think his name Gerd Getzinger. So he's out of Max Planck Institute. He used to head up Max Planck Institute, which is kind of like that nonlinear MIT type of thing out of Germany, and put out some great papers. But he wrote a whole thing on heuristic toolboxes, and I don't know if there's anything more important than getting a handle of having heuristics. Where what's crazy is a lot of people don't feel uncomfortable, but solely landed the plane because of the heuristic, right? From the plane. That's how I knew you could not make it back there. Every medic, civilian or military, while going through school, learns heuristics. They just don't know it's a heuristic. So, go back to regular paramedic type school, and you're like, okay, every female between ages of 13 and 47 with abdominal pain is an ectopic pregnancy until proven otherwise. That's a heuristic, right? You go to that worst case scenario and deal with that. JJ Johnson, we talked about heuristics and a podcast that we did with the stock off the West Coast. And it's one of those things where, they were exposed to a chemical agent and didn't realize it. And, it started on day one with a little guy who came in with what they thought were like, blisters on his feet. Like, by day 4, when he realized these are yellow tinged and this is problematic with mustard gas, they had already been exposed dramatically. But in it, the heuristic that we talked about in there is like, hey, listen, like, this is a possibility. So even if it doesn't meet the textbook of a mustard gas exposure of somebody just like, oh God, can't even look at them, but it's a blister on somebody's foot. JJ is like, you have this 8-year-old kid or whatever, who never wears shoes. He's in sandals at best. Why does he have blisters on his? He doesn't have blisters on his. These are complete calluses. It doesn't make sense. But anybody that has any kind of urticaria or this or that is an exposure until proven otherwise. And that's kind of that way to mitigate it. And so go with that same template when you're going in there. Just expect the worst, and what is that going to look like, even in the most covert. We're used to seeing pictures of things in overt type of situations. What's the covert presentation of that environmental pathology, and be able to stop and mitigate or assess. But coming from the background of the backbone of medical personnel, take those foundational assessment tools that you use on people and put that into the environment. And expect that it's going to take a little bit of research and digging in, but if you're going out and you're supporting elements of saying at Gaza, like, you've got, like, knowing that going in is where you can't put a price tag on that. information that you can gather in there. And so, with that, it's physical threats, it's environmental, it's atmospheric. The sparking of something from a fire to all these things are enormous. But when we look at that, we tend to overlook just common sustainment of fluid, sugars, things that that hit in your brain and keep you going, is huge. Communication is huge. When you're the only one, leading the way in there and everybody's, 50 feet behind you trying to clear out and they're getting stalled behind and you're moving, just no talk and things like this will start playing a lot in your head. You just feel more alone when you're in there, especially even on a 2 or 3 man team. Now they feel like they're that separate thing, and this is great. What is going on here? And that ambiguity of what's going on is problematic.
So you mentioned, getting access, and then you start expanding out, making room for follow-on people, et cetera, et cetera. Are there any principles when it comes to destabilization, right? Because you can't necessarily just keep pushing more crap out of the way, because that could have been cribbing something really heavy, right?
Absolutely.
So is there some kind of just basic principles of how we do this safely?
There is, in a lot of these things, a lot of what I'm placed to do in training and TTP development and things like this is very open brainstorming. But one of those things that we always discuss is somebody that's in that group, whether they are still outside as you're inside, and you're able to keep comms up through some sort of verbal non-comms type of stuff, or comms, is somebody needs to, I don't want to say take command, but somebody needs to be that leader. And so we always say a fire chief's a fire chief until he picks up a hose. Now he's a firefighter. He's lost that global sense of what's going on, right? He's lost being able to see those pieces. You may have to go in and help, but you need to be able to disengage, helping as soon as that's done, and you can disengage and get back the full picture of what's going on and trying to piece that together. And that's probably one of the most critical roles ever. And that doesn't have to be somebody who's a higher rank or anything like that. It's just somebody that can sit back and kind of visually see that whole picture and remind people of this, remind people of that. Hey, make sure you're checking for this. If you guys see anything that's larger than X, Y, or Z, anything wood, anything this, that we can use to be able to crib up, and to use as some sort of support system within there, right? And I don't want to use common terminology for tech rescue of shoring and things like this, because now you're talking raker shoring with wood and 16 penny nails, and it takes me X to do this or that, or Paratech gold struts and all this other stuff. But keeping an eye out, a lot of tunnel systems, for example, as you get into, have items that are in there. Even when you look at those things across the border and things like this, it's kind of amazing. They have some structural support areas that's in between those that you run into issues. And so, being able to move and stay next to whatever wall is still standing is huge. Having that load bearing wall, because anything that collapses will still put you in a void. And not getting crushed, right? If you're moving into an area, finding that too, because that's the void you want to stay in as you continue to move forward. But yeah, absolutely. And it's just one of those situational, I hate, it's just so overused, situational awareness, but seeing everything as an asset or a vulnerability to you is what it is. So when you see, larger wood, studs from a wall, things like that, those are absolutely assets. Although you think of vulnerabilities because you're going to move them, just be able to set them to the side, and always remember which way it is. Once you have no vision, doing a right-handed search pattern, staying on that right hand, so if anything goes wrong, you can turn and just hit your left hand on there. You're not going to be presented probably with very many egress options, which is very problematic. Yet, as the team is moving behind them, one of those things that they need to look for any kind of, for lack of a better word, like safe haven type of thing. So, as we're moving here, there's a door over here that, obviously it's going to be back closer to the low burn wall. It's standing. If anything goes wrong, that's where we're going to move back into. and bring anybody who gets injured. You're going to have injuries. You're going to have problems, right? From exhaustion to physical injuries, to the whole varied medical issues, from difficulty breathing to this to that. You're in an area that's not usually habitated, and you don't have ventilation systems set up. You don't have a lot of those things, and even if you did, once the collapse occurs and bomb hits place and you're going in deeper, those aren't going to be active anymore.
Right. Speaking of ventilation, like we talked about, just different gases that they can come up through the earth. They could be in canisters that now have been squished. I guess other than like some kind of like man-made chemical, like a Ticks and Tims or Seaburn, like excluding those things, because that's beyond what I was hoping for. But just like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, like your basic stuffs.
And those are two predominant, right? Just because you're going in an area that is going to be lacking ventilation and outside sources of natural ventilation or animated ventilation. Some of the systems in buildings, when we're talking urban stuff like you were, once you take those offline, and there's especially like air conditioning and things like this, and you have freon releases and you have all these other things, it just kind of gets compounded. You have natural things with housing and all these other gases that go in. But once you go down there, and even if you think about like caves, it's riddled with bad things the deeper that you go in there, and you are just you're in a very unique contextual environment where everything that, like, as you're breathing and exhaling, because you're not rolling with SCBAs in there. And the thing to remember too is, when you get into oxygen depletion, your PAPRs and stuff isn't going to do anything on those situations. That's full on. You need air. You need to be breathing contained air, self-contained air. And so with it, the PAPRs may assist in certain areas which are much more readily available than your SCBA bottles and things like this. But it'll take you down quickly, and that's one of the needs for communication. So you don't put everybody into that environment, and if you are able to do a quick and fast extraction of somebody that's in there, that you're doing it without causing one after another, and it seems silly, but I would tell anybody that's kind of listening to this is it's a couple of degrees of separation, but you'll see the mentality that goes on into something like that. But it's a horrific death. It's just sad to watch, but it's all on video from 1993, and it's in the fire service. Every year, guys do a thing called the Denver drill, and so Mark died in there, and he was in a collapse area on like a second story right by the window, but they couldn't lift him up and out of that window, and they did the same thing over and over and over, and the guys were coming out barfing and this and that, and until somebody's like, fine, and it goes on for a while. Watch the whole video. It chills your heart to watch that, but that's the cycle that we get into with that, and in the end, a lot of people go down, a lot of mistakes happen until somebody's like, hey, can we not just breach the wall and pull them out that way instead of you trying what is taking a bunch of us down in there, and kind of learn from those past mistakes of where our brains get kind of kooky in those areas when we work into it, and it's very easy for us to one variable to go wrong and end up taking out the whole team with that. I mean, I can remember, where I worked in Florida, a couple knives going in for person down in a boat, and not realizing it was just carbon monoxide. It was running, and it was just parked behind a house, and I think like 4 firefighters ended up going down, just not realizing what's pretty obvious when we stand back with 2020 hindsight, but we make those mistakes, and your subterranean environments are lethal.
Like just bringing in ventilation. Obviously, they have pre-made ventilation things that are specifically designed for that environment, I'm sure, but you don't have it. So, like,
You're talking, fans just and fans, tubings, and all that stuff. But you're not rolling through with that. I mean, you're not. Those are things like a couple of guys are carrying those fans, and so going into that it's very problematic. So having some way to monitor what's going on that you may not smell, see, or realize you're feeling, right? You almost get that euphoria type of thing going. Being able to mitigate that is absolutely huge. And a lot of that.
So I mean, is it just as simple as? Is it just as simple as fans, or like a?
You can. Depending on the area, I've seen some video of this that we trained on, and then tried to replicate. But you'll have certain things where there are sources even for light, which is kind of a little bit heavier in like Afghanistan and stuff, where it was literally like layers of plexiglass layers dug through it, and that's what provided light every so often for down a tunnel. But understanding like you can have somebody on there and access that and break those open. Like if you need that as an egress, you need that broken anyways. But breaking that open is going to provide a natural ventilation. If you think about with any kind of fires and things like that, knowing certain building construction when we talk about buildings is kind of huge when we look at, let's say like Benghazi type of thing. It's heartbreaking as a former firefighter to bastard went down, and they couldn't get him out the bathroom, right, that window, and he was right by the sink. That's the one area that is, you hit a gold mine as a firefighter, is if you could find a sink, because you basically kick that P trap out and breathe out the PVC or the metal, whatever goes into the wall, and that's going to be your freshest air. And that if you run out of air as a firefighter, but if you're in a fire that engine company can't go in, it's the truck company that goes in and cuts holes into that roof and causes vertical ventilation. So having those type of lights or anything that's up there, being able to access that and create any kind of vertical ventilation is hugely advantageous. The way that'll pull out and clean that air a little bit, takes the heat away from a fire, but at the same time it's gonna provide some sort of ventilation in an area that typically has none. So you have that in some of the construction of tunnel systems and things like that. When you're going into that, you just need to be aware of. You need to look for the context, what we're going into, and they're going to need some sort of light if they use that for movement and things like this. Buildings obviously have some of those built in, but there's elevator shafts and things like this that you can go in, open a door. Having some elevator keys if you're working in urban environments is great for escape and evasion. It's great for a lot of things, but it's also great for ventilation too, because if it's an access of a building that goes down that far, and there's probably an elevator, potentially, right? Stairwell, your stairwells and hotels, anything that goes sub. One stairwell goes to the roof, one goes kind of 4x4, doesn't have access through. Find the one with the roof, open that door, open those doors in between, and you can provide natural ventilation that way.
What would tell you, I guess, when it comes to like gases or just other hazards, that like this is not the building you're looking for? Like you're wasting your time trying to expand this out, move on to something else.
If you're looking for it as a spot where you're going to go in and open up kind of a closer access or kind of a protected environment with your alamoing it or something like that. To be honest with you, if you're accessing it after a strike and that building has collapsed and is no longer 10 floors or wherever you mentioned before, those are typically the structural damage outside will tell you a lot. of how big and how deep that would have gone down. I hate to get into goofiness of it, but it's usually the nuance and subtlety that gives you the best intel on things. But depending on where you're at too, what is that soil composition, right? If I would get a Connex and dig it down in the ground, and I'm in Florida, right? Problematic for a lot of reasons, right? Not just sinkholes that we hear about all the time in there, but just because the sand type of soil that's there, where you get into the Carolinas, you get into maybe some red clay and things like this. That shit's a pain in the ass to dig into, and much more solid as far as the structural stability of what's going on. So even if you're looking at a building that had that occur, knowing the basic geology of what that is. Are we in sandstone? Are we in this? Are we in that? Will give you a great intel of whether it's worth it or not, just because of the damage that will be below that. Also, even if you're making it and dropping something into that, and you're creating a kind of a subterranean thing that you can access and build up, that geology, that soil is going to tell you a lot of whether it's going to be more harm than good.
Awesome. Obviously, subterranean is like an enormous topic, but I guess going with the general theme of what we're trying to do, is there anything else that, things like water, electrical, any other dangerous things that'll like ruin our day?
That's huge. I mean, the electric piece is huge. Obviously, with moisture exposed wires, things like this, but also, you'll get a good sixth sense where you're operating at. Right, you're in the middle of kind of a desert, and you're going through in those areas, and you're going through a cave. Whether you're looking for someone, or you're looking for a place that you can, call base camp. It's kind of a moving base camp every few days or anything like this. That environment will kind of tell you what to watch out for. Urban, it's funny because when you talk about subterranean, it's more recently, I guess, that we start thinking subterranean potentially being urban also. And what's crazy about that is your pathology, your threats to yourself, vulnerabilities of your game going into that are exponentially worse than urban, for the reasons that you mentioned before, right? Whether it's because of the technology, with electricity, with wiring systems, with that occurring in countries that don't have potentially the building codes that we do. It's bad enough where we are, right? Let alone when you go outside of there. Never, in another country, just do not trust the engineering that occurred there. And even when you're going in and building out Karez, there's engineering in a Karez that is in there for weapons and food caches and things like this. Is never trust that whatsoever, and never assume that it's kind of up to our standards. And to be honest with you, anybody that's worked inner city and fire, EMS, or any doing rescue for USAR after earthquakes or anything, you're really amazed that once you get into lower socioeconomic things and how that's built, is wow, these studs supposed to be 16-inch on center. That's kind of how I plan on getting through walls, and it's a joke, and the conduit and all that presents enormous risks of fire hazards, shock hazards, all those type of things when you go into that. And the big thing I can tell people too is being the PFC podcast here too is, we're talking about just accessing and gaining and maneuvering and mobility within subterranean. When you add a casualty onto that to have to evacuate, holy shit, man! Like that's that just added complexity to complexity, which is, and so not overthinking that is huge. I mean, critically thinking about what it is, but not basically just putting yourself into such a dog chasing its tail. It's like a reentry pathway on a SVT or something. Like it's easy to get your brain to go into this whole thing where all of a sudden you're concerned about things that you don't need to be. Try and break it down as simple as it has to be without taking and making it overly simple where you're going to get nailed. But what needs to be done, reframing the problem is really what's up with that, because now moving Casualty through those areas, having to take pit stops and reassess and do this, you're reassessing the environment, you're reassessing the patient, you're reassessing the potential implication, you're setting up mitigation strategies, you're pulling out that equipment that you may need. And when you're moving it, it's the same thing as confined space type of things, because in any kind of subterranean, you can run into confined space all day long, right? I mean, look at the rescue of the soccer team in Thailand and things like that. I mean, that's, there's caves and then there's caves. And so with that, I would just always say a lot of stuff, especially in some of the earthquakes in the 80s, 90s in California, led to a lot of the stuff that is kind of mainstay now with crush injuries and things like that. You read the AARs on the firefighters talking to that young woman in the car that was collapsed on the bridge, for hours. And then the second that they lifted that object off of her, she was in cardiac arrest in 17 seconds. And for why we do the crush injury stuff, why a medic needs to take an active role, and like no one lifts until we clear it with me. And there's a certain thing that goes on. Point being is a lot of stuff came out, and it got to the point where not just with soft medics, but with USAR medics, disaster medics, got so highly trained and had so much more capabilities. Do we bring the ER to the patient, or do we bring the patient to ER? And I think we talked about this before, but the answer is contextual. Depends on the situation you're in. What's the threat to the rescuers? What's the threat to the patient? And in the end, you may not have that much time, so you may want to just do enough that hopefully they don't die as you're trying to get them the hell out of there. And then there's other times where you may be very safe that you can go full Monty and knock out a lot of stuff and really stabilize them. Other times you may just be able to stabilize them, hopefully just enough to be able to get them to a little bit safer area. But being able to mitigate that in your head is vitally important, and realizing that once you're in that type of environment too, every medical treatment that you use that would be considered more advanced, you decide to do a crike. Okay, well now kind of dedicated somebody to potentially on a bag, somebody that the positioning of them. So you're talking chest tubes, you're talking whatever you're talking. Every medical modality that you input into that system exponentially increases the time that you're able to move them and get them out, because every movement now becomes very strategic, and not ripping that airway out or ripping that chest tube out or doing whatever. So in it becomes a thinking man's game. There's the best practice is what you come up with on the spot, because context, best practices often are come out of a hospital a lot of times, or an environment that we put parameters into. There's the parameters of ambiguity is a problem when you are out of that hospital. So on it, the best practices are what you kind of create in there. And I always go back to a medic that I know and ended up being at an organization and going back to his SFT for some team leader time, but had one of his guys that was shot. He was exfilling a patient in the back of a Hilux, and it was a long to the link up. It was a little bit of a drive, and about 10 minutes into that thing, one of his guys and one of his operators like, "Hey, dude, by the way, I forgot." He was in the back of the Hilux with him, kind of holding security. He's like, "I got shot. Put a drinking on, but I don't think it's working." And Alex, let's say Alex, is hysterical, way more ADHD than me, and he's like, that. First of all, I'm your medic, and that would have been awesome for you to tell me that a while ago. That would have been cool. So in the future, maybe we should do that. But he went back and took a look at him and saw that. So, when we have an issue and that tourniquet is applied and it was tight, so he tried to tighten it. Tight as it goes. It was very, very high. Couldn't get it any higher. So in it, you start thinking, okay, if that's it, then we're applying a second tourniquet. We're going through like, what are those best practices? And in the end, it was already high. Yeah, you could put one lower, and it was going to be kind of difficult because of some other issues going on. So maybe you could have slowed that down to where you change that pressure, almost like water pipe. I'd say a pressurized water line. But in the end, you tried something that didn't work. Tried something else that didn't work. Kind of had him sit back on a bag that was back there, and the best maybe a semi-Fowler's position type of thing. And he grabbed eventually he grabbed the magazine out of an M4 and shoved it underneath that tourniquet, and which went above, up into that inguinal area, cranked it down, and it worked. So I've yet to read that in a best practices thing. So you create your best practices on there, be able to do it. Same with those principles of lift an inch, crib an inch, being able to go to an exterior wall and provide some sort of support that's in there. We've gained unbelievable support with nothing but like high lift jacks and wood. Take a couple high lift jacks, throw your 2x4s, rotate them up so you don't get the flex on there, lift, and we just stabilize the entire half of something that there's no way you should think. Your brain doesn't think you should be lifting that much with a high lift jack, and you're talking tons because you're not lifting the whole piece up. You're stabilizing an area.
Well, thank you, Sean. I really appreciate you walking me through all this.
Absolutely, and I would tell any of your listeners, go ahead and research it and realize that the definition for anything subterranean is anything that goes underground. So that can be basements, multi-level basements, underground parking, to anything you see, mountains, remote, into the desert floor, your caves. I mean, it's hundreds of things that are on, all with its own pathology, all with its own things, and start plugging in those things that like raise the hair on the back of your neck, like your Spidey sense. Like, I would hate to be in that shit. And start coming up with, how would you assess that? How would you look at it and template it off of your basic patient assessment stuff? But now you're assessing the environment. And when you get that patient, now you're assessing a bunch of shit.
Cool, man. Well, again, thank you again.
No problem. I appreciate it.
That's it for today's podcast. Make sure to go to our website, www.prolongedfieldcare.org. Check out our free downloads and a ton of other helpful information. Grab a bag of our fresh roasted PFC coffee, links in the description below, and stay on the bleeding edge of combat and austere medicine. This is Dennis for the PFC podcast, out.